Welcome to the Arrive U.S. Immigration Law podcast with your hosts Jeremy Richards and Christine Jerusik. Join us as we navigate the complex world of U.S. immigration law with a special focus on opportunities and challenges for Canadians and Mexicans under the USMCA. Whether you're a professional, business owner, or family member seeking to work and live in the United States, we're here to guide you every step of the way. So sit back and relax. You have arrived.
Welcome back to another episode of the Arrive podcast. I'm here again with Christine.
Hi.
And we are going to be talking about a lot of changes. So I know we talked around when Trump took office that there were some upcoming changes to the USMCA and adjudication of TNs. Well, the USMCA itself has not changed.
Right.
But USCIS, just in the last week, updated its definitions and explanations for some of the TN occupations, adjudication process, licensure, and how they interpret who qualifies under the USMCA. So it's a pretty big deal.
And CBP came up with an update as well in our Buffalo ports here and how they want people to obtain interviews.
Exactly. So let's start there. So you used to be able to call in the Port of Buffalo, so everybody understands.
Well, you used to be able to just show up.
That was pre-COVID.
Yeah.
Right. So pre-COVID, you could just show up at the border and get an interview, and they would just take you an interview as long as it was
You
Monday
waited
to Friday.
in line. Yeah.
Actually, they didn't care. You could just show up. But then they limited that to Monday to Friday, 8 to 3, and you had to call in and get an appointment, which actually the process stunk. It was kind of cumbersome. But now
you schedule your own appointment online.
Yep.
Through an online scheduling system.
So you just go to the Port of Buffalo's website, and you can find it on our website as well. If you want to do scheduling for an L or a TN, it actually applies to those seeking waivers to the United States. If you need a non-immigrant waiver to the U.S., you can apply. You can set up your appointment directly through the CBP website. And the Port of Buffalo, for you that don't know what that means the Fort Erie Peace Bridge, the Niagara Falls Rainbow Bridge, and the Lewiston Queenston Bridge. Those are the ones that you can schedule through that, and it's all automated online, which I think is a great move, personally.
I mean, why not, right? We have the technology. Why not have people pick their own appointments instead of have someone sitting on the phone scheduling them?
Waste of time.
Yeah.
I mean, you still can call in and they would do it for you, but they prefer you to do it online.
Yeah. And last time I checked, they were booking about 3 weeks out. So for all of the bridges, it used to be able to call and ask, where's the next available? But now it looks like the next available is 3 weeks out for any of them.
Yeah. I checked just today and it was the 17th of July.
Oh, so even further.
Available.
Yeah.
It was July 14th when they launched it.
Yeah.
When they launched it 2 days ago.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're looking at least 3 weeks out.
3 weeks.
So you need to plan ahead if you're going to be using the Buffalo port. Now, this does not apply to other ports. And if you're flying,
or airports, right?
If you're pre-flight inspection, you just need a boarding pass. So you can still do same day if you're flying. So you don't need to worry about it.
Yeah, there's other options.
Yeah, and there's Ogdensburg and Thousand Islands area. Those ones will still take you when you show up.
Detroit as well.
Good luck at Detroit. I just talked to somebody today. Said,
we don't
should I go
recommend
through
it?
Detroit? And I said, do you want to get your visa or not? Just like Pearson. Go for it. I still have nightmares from our visit to Pearson. That airport's awful. And so is there adjudication for applications to the U.S.?
No, it's not awful. It's just inconsistent. We just don't see consistent decision making there. So it's hard to advise people when we don't have an adjudicator that's following the same rules as we know them.
Yeah.
So
JFK and Toronto are like two of the worst airports in the world.
Yeah.
Like you run around like crazy people trying to get to your gates.
JFK, reading the message boards, JFK is like really good for
adjudications
for people coming in with green cards that have been out for a long time.
Because they see them all the time.
Yeah, and they're really good with those people. So
we digress. So that's a new thing to be aware of if you're applying for a TN or an L. So a TN and L1 visa at the port of entry in Buffalo. You need to schedule that online. And then the other big changes apply to like we already alluded to, the definitions that they have for some occupations, as well as a big one, self-employment, which we've already, so it's an update and clarification. So these aren't necessarily changes. This has always been the law. It's the interpretation of the law. And reading through them, this is advice that we've been giving our clients for forever, as long as we've been interpreting the U.S.
Right.
Census.
So we're thinking a lot of this is not a change so
Not
much
to us,
as so much as a clarification and actually putting into words the way that the TNs have been adjudicated.
Yep. So if you have been practicing in this area like we have for years, this is nothing new. But CBP and USCIS, and there is a line in here, and we'll probably run into it when we're going through this with you, where it says that CBP and USCIS are trying to align their adjudication process. And that's what I think you see here is they're admitting that there can be some inconsistencies in the way CBP will do an application, as well as the way USCIS will do an application. And it seems like they're trying to close the loop there. Also, another thing that I've read into these regulations or these updates is they're really trying to protect the U.S. labor market and the way that they're defining and limiting to who qualifies now.
Right. They're making it a more narrow definition of what the profession is included in the professions.
Yep.
And, we have seen officers adjudicate in line with the new regulations, the new way that these are defined in the past, but sometimes not too. Sometimes there's a little more wiggle room at certain ports of entry.
Yep. And you're always going to have the discretion of CBP officer or USCIS adjudicator, right? But when possible, you want to make sure you fit within these clarified definitions. So the first one is self-employment. So self-employment, we've always discussed this on the podcast. You've been listening, and we also have several blogs that talk about self-employment on a TN. Well, self-employment is not allowed on a TN. Let's just put it out there. It's not allowed to be self-employed. And when it talks about self-employment, it's talking about you being self-employed inside the United States. And it gives factors that it looks at to determine self-employment. Whether the U.S. enterprise is a separate legal entity from the alien, and when they talk about aliens, they're talking about, foreign nationals. Whether the alien has substantial control over the enterprise for which he or she will work in the United States, and whether evidence indicates that the U.S. enterprise was established to facilitate the alien's self-employment in the United States. So here you're talking about a foreign national who has created a U.S. entity that they have at least 51% ownership in, and that entity was created for them to do business in the United States. That is not allowed.
Right.
You're not allowed, and we've been telling people this for years, you're not allowed to incorporate your own company in the United States and then sign contracts and service those contracts through your U.S. entity. And they've made that very clear here. Not allowed. You cannot use your own entity to sponsor yourself or to facilitate contracts if it is a U.S. entity. So that's a very important distinction.
If the petitioner is a U.S. entity.
Correct, that you have ownership in. So you are not eligible. It has to be a substantially separate entity from you who is coming in to work. You cannot be a part of that entity in a controlling aspect, okay? So sole proprietors, you can't do that. It has to be legally distinct from you, okay? So you can't hide under a corporation, and we've seen people try to do this in the past, and we've advised against it. You cannot create an entity and say that entity is your employer. No, that's self-employment is if you have control over it. And they give some factors that they use to establish whether or not you have control over the entity. Whether the alien has established the receiving enterprise, so are you the one that formed it? Whether the alien has sole or primary control of the enterprise, whether the alien is the sole or primary owner of the enterprise, and whether the alien is the sole or primary recipient of the enterprise's income, right? So you're funneling. A lot of individuals come to us and they say, I do work in the U.S., and I do it as a contractor, but they won't sign contracts with the foreign national, so I want to create a U.S. entity because they will sign contracts with the U.S. entity, and then I want to pay myself through that U.S. entity. No.
And come in on a TN and do the
And
work.
No, you cannot do that.
Correct.
And it makes it very clear you cannot do that. So you can't even funnel income through that. It's not a mechanism that's allowed for TN status. Now, and then it continues to talk about incorporating an enterprise that you're going to be self-employed in, and doing this for the purpose of employment in the United States. You cannot do that. So anything that looks like that is not allowed under a TN.
Right. If you want to do that, stay in Canada and manage your U.S. company remotely, because you can't do it in the United States.
And brings us to the next point of self-employment, where it talks about what is allowed. Prearranged professional services. And this is what we've always explained. If you want to obtain TN status, you can do it as long as you have prearranged professional services for an enterprise in the United States that you do not have ownership in.
Right. So you can be maybe self-employed in Canada. You have a company in Canada that you control, and you're working for that company.
So you can own a company all you want in Canada. You can be 100%.
Yeah.
Because it's Canadian.
And that company has a contract with a U.S. company to have you come to the United States to provide services that qualify as a TN profession. Under that contract, you can come in and apply for a TN. But the petitioner on that application is not the U.S. entity.
Correct. And it's typically the foreign entity. If it's with USCIS, or if it's at the border, there isn't really a petitioner, if you want to think of it that way, right?
I think we usually frame it that the Canadian company is the petitioner.
And the receiving entity is the U.S. entity.
Correct.
Yep.
And they're coming in to service a contract with a U.S. company.
And that's what it lays out here. It talks about to constitute prearranged professional services, a formal arrangement must be in place to provide professional services to an individual person, so you can do it for an individual, or a professional or an enterprise in the United States. The formal arrangement may be through an employee-employer relationship or through a signed contract between the alien and the alien's employer, so your employer can send you through contract that they have with a U.S. entity, and a person or enterprise inside the United States.
And that employer is outside the United States.
Correct.
And it doesn't need to be in Canada. Let's be clear here. So we talk about a foreign employer. We've done this where the employer is, we have a Canadian citizen. They're working for a Australian company.
Correct.
That Australian company has a contract with the United States.
You just have to be Canadian.
They need to send that Canadian to come in and do their engineering role or whatever TN role it is in the United States. And that Australian company doesn't have to have a Canadian office.
Just a contract.
Exactly.
Yep. And then it goes on to define this further, and it says the enterprise can be, and this is talking about the activities in the United States, the enterprise can be any entity constituted or organized under applicable law, whether or not for profit, and whether privately owned or government owned, including any corporation, trust, partnership, sole proprietorship, joint venture, or other association. So you can provide services to whoever it is.
Anybody, yeah.
As long as the receiving entity is in the United States. So I think it's great clarification. I wish they would have came out with this clarification earlier, because we've just battled with USCIS over this.
And CBP sometimes too. So I feel like this is at least something we can point to now and say, hey, we've been doing it this way. This is the way to do it. And you guys need to acknowledge that now this is official. We can actually do this.
Yeah, I've had 2 battles recently with CBP and USCIS for clients who have
are in this exact
entities
situation,
and are servicing U.S. clients. One of them, the 4 employees were approved, but then USCIS denied the owner.
Oh, because he's self-employed.
But they were saying he was
self-employed. Canadian company.
Correct.
Yeah.
And if you read the regs now, I could cite to their exact clarification and show how they're wrong.
Send them back to the border.
And this was done, unfortunately, about a month or so after they did that. But we did. We sent him back to the border.
I mean, before they made the change.
Before they made the change. So, but we did send him back with clarification to a port of entry, and he did get in.
He was approved. Okay, good.
But it's unfortunate because, USCIS gave us the runaround on that, and they were wrong. And then they update their definitions after they deny us. Like, ridiculous.
That happens sometimes.
Welcome to the world of immigration. And the other big change that we want to get to too is licensure. Licensure is a big deal, and how they define licensure. Now, it's important to understand that we have competing organizations when you're talking, or competing government entities here that we're dealing with. You have the Department of State, you have U.S. Department of Labor, and you have U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So when you're dealing with visa issues, you're dealing with one of those three agencies typically. Now, Canadians have the advantage that they don't need a visa. So when it talks about a lot of visa issuance issues, Canadians can forget some of those because they don't need a visa. That's why Canadians can still get an H-1B even though they're subject to the 2-year foreign residency requirement, if you know what that is. Yep. Why? Because they don't need a visa. So they can just go to the border and get stamped and get that H-1B. And a TN isn't really a visa. It's a status. You don't actually get a visa in your passport.
In that case, CBP is really playing the role of DOS, right? Because they're making the decision on admissibility, and they're making the decision on whether or not this person has the qualifications. So it's, Canadians are lucky in that. And I know a lot of Canadians complain about pre-clearance. Oh, we have to go through pre-clearance in Canada. Why can't we just fly in? It is a privilege to have pre-clearance in your airport.
99% of the citizens of the world wish they had pre-clearance.
We are very lucky in Canada to have our our U.S. pre-clearance. And it's a great benefit for Canadians to have that. Just walk through CBP and you're admissible to the United States. That's amazing.
Yep. And so the licensure requirement. So it talks about licensure, and this has always been the case for TN status. If you read the regulations in the Foreign Affairs Manual, and the Foreign Affairs Manual is issued by the Department of State. Well, the Department of State says that licensure is a post-entry requirement, that licensure cannot be required at the port of entry. It's only a requirement that has to be fulfilled after entry to the United States, with some exceptions. And USCIS here in their update is saying that if you were coming to the United States to perform professional level services, you need to have that license. It isn't post-entry according to them. But also for a renewal or an extension, if you did come in without a license, let's say you're a dentist and you came in without a license, well, it's post-entry would mean you get that licensure after you come in and you meet the state requirement so that you can practice as a dentist or a lawyer or whatever it might be, right? So USCIS here is saying that if you're coming to the United States to work as a lawyer, for example, you need a license to do that.
Before you can apply for your first TN?
And that's where it's at odds with the Foreign Affairs Manual, because the Foreign Affairs Manual says you can still get the TN without the license, but you have to get the license after you come in.
Right. So before you would apply for your second TN, which is when
it would be reviewed. USCIS to renew it, you better have that license, or USCIS is not going to extend it.
Okay.
Is what they're saying. Same would apply to like an architect, an accountant, or any profession that's governed by licensure.
So is this going to change initial TN applications?
It should not change initial TN applications at a port of entry. However, if you read it, you know how sometimes people file ahead of time with USCIS and they want pre-approval?
Yes.
You could argue that it might affect that one.
Oh.
Because it's USCIS saying it, right? Because USCIS at that point would be adjudicating it, not CBP.
Okay.
So it'll be interesting to see how
they could point to their own guidance and
yes.
say, we're requiring licensure now.
Exactly. But then you try to argue foreign affairs, and they'll say, yeah, that's
Department of
We're
State.
not giving you a visa, right?
And we don't care what they say.
Exactly. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes into practice.
Yeah.
And again, we talked about this already, how sometimes CBP and USCIS are at odds on how they interpret things. So the law has not changed.
So if you're in the U.S. now and you're working on TN and you're working in a profession that normally requires a license,
you better get it.
You better get it before your TN expires.
Somehow.
Yeah, or show you're exempt.
Which is hard to do for a lot of these professions.
Right. And
we just ran into this issue with an architect.
Yes.
Yeah. So the person was able to get the initial TN at the port of entry without the licensure, but then they filed by mail with USCIS to get an extension. Well, guess what USCIS said? Show us your license. they didn't have a license.
They didn't obtain it in the first.
We
3
actually
years.
advised them to get a license after we said,
after
"Hey,
the initial approval.
yes," and we said, "Hey, that's a post-entry requirement." So
You're
that
gonna be
means you better
required.
get that. You better get that license if you
Yeah.
want to get this extended. So, and the same applies to H-1B. So if you read into it, H-1Bs, for example, if you're coming to H-1B on as a doctor, you get a limited 1-year H-1B that allows you to get a social security number, then it allows you to get your license, so that then they will extend your H-1B.
Well, and that's
after
always
that.
the argument we hear, right? They say,
can't
"Oh,
get
is
it.
a license required? I just graduated. I don't have my license yet. I can't get it unless I perform some work for my employer, and I need the TN to come in and do the work."
Yep.
So it's kind of a catch-22.
And that's why it's traditionally been a post-entry requirement
Gotcha.
to allow you to get the social security number, get licensure, and then you would then
Okay, so
have to
take
prove it to
note.
get an
Anybody
extension.
who's working in the United States on TN right now in a profession that requires licensure, get
better
your
have
license.
it if you're going to extend it.
Is that like accounting would be included in that as well, right?
Accountant, yep.
So you're going to renew your TN as
Dentist,
an accountant. You
doctor.
better be licensed.
Doctors can't get TNs
Doctors,
anyway.
dentists,
Not if they're
veterinarians,
vets, all of that.
all of those engineers.
Engineers. So we're done with licensure. That's
Okay.
what it says about licensure. So if you're in an occupation that's governed by a licensure, pay attention. That's what you should take away from this, to make sure that you're meeting that
And it's generally
requirement.
state licensure that you have to prove,
Generally,
right? Now, I believe they will also accept if you have a license in Canada.
Depending on the
In your
definition
province?
of the occupation. Yeah.
Okay, and depending on what the occupation requires.
Yep.
Oh, wow.
Right. So the example they actually give is if you're coming to the United States as a Canadian lawyer to advise on Canadian law, then you're fine. But if you're coming to advise on U.S. law,
Then you're fine without a license.
because you're advising on foreign law.
Okay.
You better have a license, though, if you're going to be advising on U.S. law.
Mm-hmm.
Because you
Okay.
can't do it.
That makes sense. I understand that.
Okay, so now we're going to go through some of these occupations that they give clarifying definitions for. And I think this is where the bulk of the changes happen. So scientific technician, technologist is one of the occupations we deal with quite a bit. And this really doesn't have any, this is clarifying information. So if you're a sci-tech, as the short term for it, you need to be working explicitly in one of these areas, and they want to make it clear if you're not in one of these areas, you're not getting a sci-tech TN. So agricultural sciences, astronomy, biology, chemistry, engineering, forestry, geology, geophysics, meteorology, or physics. You have to be in one of those fields, and you have to have the ability to solve practical problems in those fields. And the next component is I think the biggest part, is you have to work in direct support of a supervisory professional. So you cannot be operating on your own. You have to be working in direct support of a person who in their own right is qualified in one of those fields, and you're their support personnel.
Someone with a license, probably.
Someone with a license. And it typically is. And that's where you can run into issues, right? Because we've been getting able to get away with in the past, you say you're an engineering technician and you're just working under a degreed engineer. Mm-hmm. Not anymore. According to this, that better be a licensed engineer. Now we're going back to the licensing requirement, right? Because someone that's advising on engineering principles in most states, you better have an engineering license. And you have to be working in direct support of somebody who has that license. Now, and then it really gets, it starts to clarify. Individuals have been able to argue that they are working in biology or chemistry, and they give the example here as a radiological technologist reporting to a physician. And it really says, it's very clear that does not qualify, because you are, and here it gives the example of providing direct patient care. So anytime there is a medical profession and you're providing direct patient care, whether you're a physician or any other position you want to argue for a TN purposes, it doesn't qualify. So just red flag, direct patient care. If your position involves direct patient care, TN is not the visa for you. Mm-hmm. Start looking at H-1B or elsewhere. It's not a TN.
Right.
Anything with direct patient care, period. Sci-tech, med tech, whatever it is direct patient care, you're done.
Okay.
You don't qualify.
That makes sense.
And so it makes it very clear that that is not allowed. Unless it's research. And that patient care is incidental. So it has to be incidental to your job. It can't not be the primary thing. And it has to be research related. Then there's a little bit of an exception carved out. But it's incidental and your primary purpose is research. Okay? And then it also clarifies, and we've always said this, that the trades do not qualify.
But then you may also be able to apply under research assistant for that role too.
Correct.
It's a separate
that's a separate occupation.
TN profession.
Yep. Yeah. You may have your own standalone
Depending on what you're doing. Yeah.
Yep. And it reiterates, and if you read the regulation closely before, this was already in there, that if you're working in the construction trades, welders, boilermakers, carpenters, or electricians, even when these trades are specialized, for example, aircraft, power distribution, not admissible SciTech.
Oh, we saw that a lot under COVID.
And they added that power distribution and aircraft in there.
Yeah.
They explicitly state it now. And there was a time where you could argue that aircraft technicians were able to get a TN. Not anymore.
We've made that argument successfully before, but I don't think we would be able to do it now under this new guidance.
Not anymore.
No.
So it makes it very clear who does and doesn't qualify as a SciTech. But here's the one that you alluded to earlier. It also provides necessary clarification, and we battled with CBP over this one before, where it says you can qualify by having theoretical knowledge, and it says typically that's acquired through a 2-year degree or some sort of certificate. But then it also clarifies USCIS weighs the lack of degree in consideration of the entire record. So it clearly states that a degree is not required.
Or diploma. Because usually what our SciTechs have is a 2-year engineering technologist or engineering technician diploma. And even without that, though, we've been successful in getting SciTechs approved. And now it clarifies that you can use job experience in lieu of that diploma or that degree.
It's not an absolute requirement.
You don't have it. Yep. Yeah, it's possible.
And it explicitly states a scientific technician technologist is not required to have a bachelor's degree and may instead provide documentation of extensive work experience directly related to the profession.
That's good. It just puts in writing what we've been doing all along. So
that was a necessary and a good clarification that they put in there. Med lab tech, again, they're defining this. Medical laboratory technologists, medical technologists, and it lays out you have to be working in one of these fields. And here, a med tech, it's right in the title, med lab tech. You must be working in a lab setting.
Right.
It's a lab. It says it right in the title.
So if you're working in a doctor's office,
providing direct, again, and then it goes back to direct patient care, you're not.
Or a hospital environment that you're not in the lab.
I had somebody the other day, I work in the OR. That's not a lab.
Yes.
You don't qualify.
Right.
Pretty straightforward. And then
it's too bad they don't open that up, though. I feel like there's a shortage of those qualified professionals here in the United States.
Rad tech. Yeah, we get them all the time.
I think there's a shortage of those.
Well, but it explicitly eliminates them.
Yeah.
And you must be coming to perform in a lab, laboratory chemical, biological, hematological, immunologic, microscopic, or bacteriological tests.
Now I know why you're not a doctor.
Diagnosis, treatment, or prevention of disease. Those are some big words.
Yeah.
So you have to be working one of those types of lab settings. If you're not qualifying.
Yep.
Okay. Again.
And I think there's a lot of confusion about this. So I'm glad we spent some time on it.
A ton of confusion.
We get a lot of calls and a lot of people sign up for consultations. And then when we explain to them the limitations of this actual TN profession, people are very surprised. So it's good. I think this guidance is helpful for people applying for jobs in the U.S., what kind of jobs they can look for.
And I was just having an exchange with a client, and they do cardiac perfusion. And they have cardiac perfusionists is what they're called.
Yeah.
They were able to get some people approved as under these.
Oh, really?
Yes. But explicitly, and we told them those were erroneous approvals. And we told them this before. And then this clarification came out.
Yeah.
And if you read in the footnote.
Do they list perfusionists in there?
So if you read in the footnote, you read in the bottom, the footnote Where's this
Who
footnote?
reads the footnotes?
Well, I'm one of those people, I guess. It says, this analysis would apply to polysomnographic technologists, cardiovascular technicians, sonographers, medical dosimetrists, nuclear medicine technologists, and other occupations working in support of physicians providing patient care. And you see it again,
Excluded.
patient care,
Yep.
but it explicitly excludes that. So necessary clarification. There was a lot of confusion. Sometimes people would come to us, oh, my friend got approved. Well, that border officer messed up. And eventually they would catch them and they'd get revoked later. But now it's very clear. So I'll be surprised if anybody gets through. Obviously, there's always those that do.
Was there any changes to registered nurses? I know they're listed.
It's the same.
Same thing with
It just
foresters.
clearly lays out that you need to have the proper physician. It just
and
says
that's the way I feel about management consultants too. They just
nothing changed.
Nothing changed. The language.
Physician,
is still
it
the
just clarifies that you have to be research only,
same, which we knew.
incidental patient care.
Nothing changed there. Computer systems analyst.
Computer systems analyst. Oh wait, did we skip? No, engineers at the bottom. Okay, computer systems analyst. This one, again, to me, it's clarifying. It's putting all the information in one spot. It's nothing new, but you need to really pay attention if you work in the computer systems field, because this is where it really narrows who qualifies for a computer systems analyst. While systems analysts may perform some programming, this category does not include programmers. A systems analyst is an information specialist who analyzes how data processing can be applied to the specific needs of users and who designs and implements computer-based processing. Systems analysts study the organization itself to identify its information needs and design computer systems that meet those needs. You are not a programmer. So if you're a computer programmer, software engineer, anything along those lines that has any developing and programming, you're not a computer systems analyst. So be very careful. The degree requirements haven't changed. That definition actually has not changed. It's always been there.
I think that's stayed the same pretty much.
They just put it all in one spot, make it easy for people to find the definition.
Yeah, and they actually laid out that the certificate requirement applies only to Mexican certificates. So people who have Microsoft certificates and certificates, IT certificates that they've obtained during their education,
doesn't qualify.
Does not qualify you.
And diploma narrowed it to U.S. and Canada.
Yep.
Your diplomas from anywhere else don't qualify you, and it must be 2 years or more.
Yeah.
So again, clarifying information, but that's a big one. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of individuals that we know.
There's some confusion there, and now they've tried to take that away.
That have been able to slide in. So
It's been helpful.
the rule that I typically give people is if you are performing more than 10% of programming or developing duties, you're not a computer systems analyst, and they're not going to approve you.
Yeah.
So that's not your occupation. And they just provide clarifying details that really don't change anything for hotel managers, animal and plant breeders.
Economists did change
Economists,
a little bit here.
yes. This is another big one.
They've always been a little bit hard on economists.
Now they're really hard.
Yeah, they've flat out said if you're an analyst, you do not qualify as an
Any
economist.
type of analyst, financial, marketing,
yes.
Real estate. Doesn't matter. If you're an analyst, be careful if you're trying to apply or you have a TN as an economist.
And I would even say if you are an economist and you're performing analysis, be careful, because they've really laid out here what kind of duties you can have and what you can be doing in your role as an economist.
So as long as you are working in an economic related field, macro or microeconomics, and it really says it. It really limits it to the field
completely
of economics.
Yeah,
like very narrowly defines it.
And we used to be able to make arguments for people working in
pretty much anything
closely related. Let's say closely related to economics. A role closely related, and we have been very successful in doing that for years. But I think the window has closed.
Yeah.
So people that are going to be reapplying for TNs as economists, you want to make
better
sure
be an economist.
Read this first and make sure that the role you're coming in for fits under this heading here.
And one of the other things that these updates do is it ties everything back to the Occupational Outlook Handbook for the Department of Labor, which is good. because it says it's going to rely on that. So if the Department of Labor says you can do it in that occupation, then you should feel comfortable. But if you're reading that definition for the Department of Labor and what you're doing doesn't fall under the definition of economist, you're not an economist. And that's what they're telling you here.
Right.
We're defining it as the Department of Labor defines an economist.
I do think we're going to see a more narrow interpretation and adjudication of TNs under that rule.
Yep. And it also says, you market research analysts, get out of here. Marketing specialists, get out of here.
Yeah.
We've seen a ton of people use it for that. So be aware if you are there, the TN is not for you. No soup for you.
Not anymore. You may be able, and we're not seeing them revoking previously approved TNs that have
Again, this is from USCIS,
maybe been approved, and maybe didn't meet these new requirements. We haven't seen any revocations.
You know how they ask you at the border, well, what do you do? And instead of saying economist, you say you're a financial analyst. You're asking for a revocation.
Right. So you've got to be careful and, understand the limitations of your role and explain to your employer, hey, I can't be doing these kind of duties in this role. I'm not authorized to work in that field.
Yep.
I'm authorized to work as an economist. Yep. Right.
Which takes us to the final one, engineers. And this is a pretty significant change.
So engineers is a broad category because we're talking about a lot of specialists here. A lot of specializations.
And it only gives 2 little paragraphs, and I'm going to read them. But these paragraphs limit the definition of what they call an engineer as opposed to how they called it, if you're familiar, under what it was called the Cronin memo, which I think expanded this definition. Well, this narrows it, pulls it back in a little bit. So you have to have a bachelor's or licensure degree or a state or provincial license for TN as under the occupation of engineer. The degree must be in the related engineering field. And this is a big one. Mm-hmm. We've seen a lot of people who have a mechanical engineering degree argue that they can get a TN as a software engineer. No, you can't. You must have a computer-related engineering degree. You used to be able to. You used to. Under this, they're saying, nope, you can't. Officers will refer again to the OOH to determine the type of degree that's suitable for that engineering occupation. So you better have the engineering degree that's suitable for that occupation you're trying to enter under.
So not only do you have to match up with the engineer category with an engineering degree, you have to match up with your specialization, civil, mechanical, electrical, chemical, to what you're doing as well.
And then it goes on and it says an engineer may not fill computer-related jobs unless he or she has credentials as a computer or software engineer in a bona fide engineering specialty, offering full engineering credentials, such as professional engineering licenses.
Software engineering license? I've never heard of a thing.
Well, software engineers don't require a license.
Right.
But if you are working again, this is a profession. So if you're working in a field that does require a licensure, then you need licensure.
Right. So all you chemical engineers.
Still qualify as a software engineer.
You need to be working in chemical engineering. You cannot.
But you chemical engineers, unless you're working with a software that deals with chemical engineering, it's going to be hard to argue that you qualify as a software engineer now.
Yes. And we've done a lot of those.
We've done a ton of those. So under this new definition, however, they're narrowing it.
Mm-hmm. They're definitely made
much more narrow interpretation. And then they're really emphasizing that licensure.
I wonder if electrical, I think that's related though. I think we can make the argument, do you think?
Depends. So depends on the electrical engineering degree. If you look at the transcripts, it'll tell you more. Right? Yeah. If you look at the transcripts,
we'll have to do a deep dive for everybody who comes across the electrical,
computer related.
But that would be the one related profession that I would think would work.
My son is an electrician, is not qualifying as an electrical engineer.
No, well, I'm just saying an electrical engineer qualifying as a software engineer.
Yeah, it depends on the courses.
I think that might work.
It has in the past. Mm-hmm. And that's when they didn't have degrees that explicitly were computer related. So they called them electrical engineering degrees. But since then, they've created computer engineering programs.
Right.
So it depends on when you got your education. It could still qualify you. But a newer one, they're separate programs.
Yes.
They've separated them completely because now they've created the computer engineering programs.
Yeah.
Right? So it depends on your
So,
education.
so the advice is, if you are studying engineering right now with the idea that you're going to come and work in the United States and you want to work as a software engineer,
Better get a good degree in
get
that.
out of your civil engineering program and transfer into computer science right now.
Exactly. And that's what they're saying. And if you look in the OOH and you look how you qualify, well, it says the same exact thing. It says that. It says you have a degree in that concentration.
I think we're going to have a lot of bad news to give to people coming back when they want to renew their TNs.
And I've already given some.
Yeah.
Yep. So things to be aware of. Some, I think, substantive clarification on how they define these roles and who qualifies for TN status. So if you are in that boat or know someone that is, make sure you review your credentials, review your job description, review the Department of Labor definition, and make sure you fit nicely within that well-defined area. If you're outside of that at all, you're giving them reason to refuse or deny your TN status. So, and this isn't the change we were expecting, and I'll add that here to close. This isn't a change to the USMCA. This is a USCIS change. This is a change to, and it's not a change. I keep saying change. It's a clarification from USCIS.
Well, it's the addition to Chapter 6 of the USCIS policy manual.
Exactly, not the USMCA. So the Trump administration still has promised in 2026 that they're going to revise the USMCA. So
I hope
that's still likely to come.
Data scientists on there.
I just talked to a data scientist yesterday.
Yeah.
They're actually.
I mean, we fit them under other professions before, but
computer systems analysts typically is what they would fall under. But that's actually a different occupation.
It is really.
It is. If you look under the
Agreed.
OOH, guess what?
Agreed. It's a different
occupation.
Yes.
It's not a computer systems
Some
analyst.
officers have been improving them, but
I
think that's going to stop.
If they're going to the OOH, they're going to start denying them.
Yeah.
Because it's a different occupation. Yeah, I talked to an individual yesterday, and a big law firm, not to be mentioned, that starts with an F, who is horrible at TN applications. Horrible. And I give them an F for every TN they do. And I reviewed one of their TNs yesterday for a client.
Yeah, it's
and
never.
They called him a computer systems analyst.
Okay.
His duties were all computer engineering duties.
Whoops.
And then they called his internal title computer engineer.
That's confusing.
Not only confusion, is completely wrong. So,
and then what was he actually doing?
He's doing engineering.
Oh, okay.
And his degree is not in computer engineering.
Oh, they're trying to retrofit it.
Yes, they're trying to fit him in as a computer systems analyst.
Rather than break the news to him that he didn't qualify.
While at the same time saying he's an engineer.
Wow.
What? A border officer sees that, they're going to jump all over it. Mm-hmm. That's an easy denial.
Yeah.
So I feel bad for that individual and the poor choice in law firm that their company used to prepare that TN. But those are the types of things that you need to be aware of if you're applying for a TN. You need to understand what these occupations, how they're defined, what are the duties you can perform, what is the education required. And if you are ill-advised, and I talked to another individual this morning. We talk to them all the time, and it's very frustrating where they get bad advice about this. So hopefully this provides some clarification on these changes from USCIS. And if you are in this boat and you're applying for a TN, I would say we admonish some caution here. Make sure your stuff's reviewed and you understand your qualifications before attempting a TN application. As always, thank you for listening. And if you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe, give us a thumbs up, and share this channel with your friends or family or those out there that you think would find this content useful. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.